Early summer had settled gently upon the village of St. Winifred's, the kind of English village where roses leaned over white fences, where sparrows gathered noisily on slate rooftops, and where everyone knew the taste of everyone else's blackberry jam. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the churchyard was alive with the pleasant hum of conversation as the annual garden tea fundraiser took place beside St. Winifred's Church. Linen tables were laid with embroidered cloths, cups of tea steamed pleasantly in the sunshine, and the choir ladies moved about distributing scones as though they had rehearsed their routes. Among the gathering sat Miss Jane Marple, small and unassuming in her pale blue dress and straw hat. She was knitting something that might become a shawl, or perhaps a scarf, depending on how the pattern felt to her hands. Miss Marple never hurried decisions. She listened while she knitted, and the villagers mistook this for absent-mindedness. It was not. At the center of the day's event was Reverend Thomas Albright, a kind, scholarly man with silver spectacles and a gentle smile. His wife, Mrs. Lydia Albright, presided over the refreshment table with a cheerfulness that felt just a touch strained, though only Miss Marple seemed to notice the tightness at the corner of her mouth. On a small table beside the Reverend's lectern lay the church's old hymn books, newly rebound after a donation drive. The Reverend spoke proudly of them, restored beautifully, some nearly 2 centuries old, a treasure of our parish heritage, he said, patting one as though it were a well-loved pet. Miss Marple's eyes lingered perhaps a moment longer than most. An old book, handled by many hands, held memories, and sometimes secrets. Just as the tea was being poured for the second time, a sudden, sharp shout cut through the pleasant air. "Stop, please. Don't do this." Every head turned. At the churchyard gate stood Eleanor Finch, a young woman of 20, dressed in a simple floral frock, her hair messy as though she had run. She looked pale, more than pale. She looked frightened. Behind her, walking swiftly and with an air of irritation, was her husband, Mr. Harold Finch, the village's new bank clerk. His smile was fixed, polite, and far too tight. "My apologies, everyone," he said in a voice that was more command than apology. "Eleanor hasn't been feeling well." But Eleanor shook her head, stepping backward, eyes darting toward the church. "I need to speak with the Reverend," she said, voice trembling. "It's about the church books. Her voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth and looked down, trembling. The crowd exchanged looks, curious looks, suspicious ones. St. Winifred's was a village that saved its greatest appetite for other people's business. Miss Marple's knitting paused. Reverend Albright stepped forward kindly. "My dear, of course. Come, let us sit a moment." But Harold's hand tightened on his wife's wrist. Too tightly, too possessively. "No, she needs rest. I'll take her home." Eleanor's eyes met Miss Marple's then, a silent, desperate plea. The Reverend looked troubled, but he hesitated only a moment. In that moment, Harold Finch led his wife quickly down the path and through the gate before anyone could speak further. The hushed murmurs began immediately. What was that about? Poor thing looked ready to faint. Well, Harold Finch is a respectable man. Respectable doesn't always mean kind, dear. Hush now, Agnes. Miss Marple did not join the murmurs. She merely looked toward the hymn books. The afternoon sun glimmered on their gilded edges. A small, quiet breeze lifted a corner of her shawl. Something had begun. Something quiet, yet unmistakably dark. beneath the lace and scones and summer roses of St. Winifred's. She folded her knitting gently. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured softly to no one in particular. "There is trouble here, and it has already begun to show its seams." The murmur of conversation did not fully return after Eleanor Finch's sudden outburst. It hovered instead in uneasy pockets, whispers under breath, glances over shoulders, and the soft, uncertain stirring of teacups against their saucers. The calm of the garden tea had been disturbed, like a still pond troubled by a single stone. Miss Marple remained seated, though her knitting lay untouched in her lap. Her eyes, pale but sharp, drifted briefly to Reverend Albright and his wife. The couple exchanged a look, not of confusion, but of concern. Mrs. Albright's hand rested lightly on her husband's arm, fingertips tightening just for a moment. Miss Marple noticed such things. She always did. The choir ladies resumed their duties first. They fluttered about, whispering theories that grew more sensational with each retelling. "A marital spat," declared Mrs. Dovely, who believed all troubles could be traced to a failure of good manners. No, I've seen that girl look pale for weeks," countered Mrs. Hayworth, lowering her voice dramatically. "There's something wrong in that house." "Oh, really, you say that about every house," sniffed Agnes Merriweather. Miss Marple did not join them. She simply watched the gate where Eleanor and Harold had left. It takes a specific kind of fear to make a young wife cry out in public, and a specific kind of control to silence her so swiftly. As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting bag. Her path led her toward the church steps where Reverend Albright stood now, polishing his spectacles, a task he tended to when troubled, though he would never admit it. "A rather unsettling interruption," he said gently as she approached. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. Poor child looked quite desperate. The Reverend sighed. "Eleanor came to speak with me 2 days ago about something regarding the hymn books, though she could barely express herself. She seemed frightened then as well. I had meant to ask her to return this afternoon. It seems she attempted to." "And her husband?" Miss Marple's voice was light, conversational, as though commenting on the weather. "A capable young man, very proper. Yet—" The Reverend hesitated. "He can be firm." "Firm," Miss Marple repeated, a polite word for a concerning quality. Before more could be said, Mrs. Lydia Albright approached, trying to smile, though it wavered slightly. "Jane, dear, would you take some lemon biscuits home with you? We've plenty left." "That's very kind," Miss Marple said, though her attention flickered past Lydia toward the church doorway, for there, nestled on the small wooden table, lay the newly rebound hymn books. 12 of them in total. Leather covers, gold lettering, pages crisp and smelling faintly of fresh glue. They looked perfectly ordinary, comfortably ordinary. Yet Eleanor Finch had wanted to speak about them. Miss Marple stepped closer, and her fingertips brushed one of the covers. The leather was smooth, but beneath it, the book felt heavier than hymn books usually were. Weighted, perhaps. Or perhaps she only imagined it. An old mind prone to suppositions. So she did not jump to conclusions. She merely stored the detail quietly in her thoughts. As she left St. Winifred's Church and walked down the shaded lane toward her cottage, the village around her seemed overly composed. Like a painting hung too straight, the roses in the vicarage garden, the laundry flapping neatly behind the butcher's shop, the distant ring of children laughing. Each ordinary thing felt almost determinedly so, as if the village wished to insist nothing unusual had happened. But Miss Marple knew better than most that villages kept their darkest secrets tucked in plain sight, wrapped in politeness and Sunday smiles. And Eleanor Finch had looked like a woman who had glimpsed something she was not meant to see. The first whisper of mystery had arrived, gentle, nearly invisible, but unmistakable, and it was tied, somehow, to the hymn books. The gentle quiet of the lane accompanied Miss Marple home, yet her thoughts did not settle. They lingered on Eleanor, her pale cheeks, her trembling voice, the way her eyes had sought help without saying a word. A young wife in distress, Miss Marple had seen such things before, many times, in many villages. There were patterns to these matters, though each case wore a different dress. She reached her gate, a simple white one with a lilac bush growing eagerly beside it. She paused to clip a stray branch, a small habitual gesture, before stepping inside. Her cottage was tidy, welcoming, filled with lace and gentle colors, the sort of home that encouraged tea and quiet reflection. She set the kettle on, but it was not tea she needed. It was clarity. Something in Eleanor's words echoed back. It's about the church books. Something hidden then, something small enough to be concealed but significant enough to cause fear. The kettle began to murmur. Miss Marple poured, sat in her armchair and gazed out her window toward the church tower rising above rooftops. Not long after, there was a polite knock. Miss Marple looked up. She rarely received unannounced visitors, and those who came tended to telegraph their approach well in advance. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Hayworth, the very same who had whispered so eagerly earlier, standing there with an expression that suggested both worry and satisfaction. Someone carrying news. "Oh, Miss Marple, I was just passing and thought I might say hello," Mrs. Hayworth began, though her face clearly said, "I came to talk." "Do come in," Miss Marple said, as though she had no idea what sort of conversation was about to begin. Tea was poured, biscuits were offered, and only then did Mrs. Hayworth lean in. "I walked past the Finch house just now," she said, lowering her voice. "Doors closed, curtains drawn. That's not natural in this weather." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Perhaps Eleanor is unwell," as her husband said. Mrs. Hayworth gave a short, disbelieving sniff. "Unwell? Harold Finch never lets her so much as speak to anyone alone. And I've heard, well, raised voices." She faltered a moment. "Not kind ones." Miss Marple let silence stretch, just long enough to encourage more. "She used to be so lively, you know, before she married him, always singing in the choir, and now she looks thinner every week." "That is troubling," Miss Marple said softly. "Oh, and another thing," Mrs. Hayworth continued, warming to her purpose. "Harold spends an awful lot of time at the church office, far more than a man whose work is at the bank would require." Her eyes gleamed. "And this business with the hymn books, well, I dare say Eleanor knows something." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. There it was, the beginning of a thread. "Thank you, dear. That's most helpful." Mrs. Hayworth left soon after, satisfied that she had contributed meaningfully to the day's unfolding mystery. Miss Marple remained seated, hands folded loosely, a controlling husband, a frightened wife, a church project involving money, a set of books newly rebound, heavier than expected. Stories rarely needed complicated motives. Human nature was repetitive, familiar, and tragically reliable. Miss Marple rose and took a light shawl, for the evening had cooled. She stepped outside again, heading not toward the church this time, but toward the Finch residence, where she could see a faint light flickering behind the curtains. She did not intend to knock. No, not yet, but she wanted to observe. And observation was one of her oldest, sharpest tools. As she approached, the quiet of the street deepened. The Finch home stood still, as though holding its breath. Then from inside came a sudden sound, a loud crash, followed by a muffled cry. Miss Marple stopped in place, the shawl held lightly around her shoulders. Something was happening already, and whatever secret Eleanor Finch had tried to reveal at the church might have just taken a frightening turn. Miss Marple remained very still, her fingertips resting lightly on the gate of the Finch home. The sound from inside, a crash, then the unmistakable choked sound of someone trying not to cry, hung in the quiet air like a tremor. The house itself was dark, except for a single lamp glowing in the front sitting room. Curtains drawn, door locked, not a home welcoming company. A moment later, another sound followed. Slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing, not hurried, not frantic, controlled. The steps of someone asserting calm after exerting force. Miss Marple knew that rhythm well. She did not move forward, nor did she retreat. Instead, she observed how the light flickered slightly, as though someone had shifted the lamp. A shadow crossed behind the curtain. Broad shoulders, a stiff posture. Harold Finch. She waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then deliberately, she turned and walked away with the quiet dignity of a woman who had simply been out for an evening stroll. Not confrontation. Not yet. Miss Marple understood timing better than most. To act too soon was to lose the truth. By the time she reached the bend in the road, the sound had ceased entirely. Only the faint hum of the evening insects remained. She headed home not quickly, but with thoughtfulness in each step. The night passed quietly in the village, though for some, sleep did not come easily. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight, and the village resumed its gentle hum. Yet something felt different. A tension threaded subtly beneath everyday routines. At the grocer, voices lowered when the Finches were mentioned. At the post office, Mrs. Hayworth was already recounting her version of events. Embellished, of course, and on the green where children played, a few adults lingered nearer than usual. Ears open, eyes wary. Miss Marple chose her path with care that morning, walking toward the church rather than the shops. She suspected she would find what she needed there. Inside, Reverend Albright stood beside the hymn books again, though today he was not smiling. His brow was furrowed deeply as he flipped through one book after another, examining the bindings. He looked up when Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple, I admit I'm a bit troubled. Something seems odd." She approached gently. "Do tell." The Reverend hesitated, then handed her a hymn book. To any other eye, it would appear perfectly ordinary, but Miss Marple held things lightly, with awareness in her fingertips. And yes, there it was, a faint unevenness beneath the inner back cover, as though something had been stitched or inserted during the rebinding. The Reverend lowered his voice. "I fear someone may have hidden something inside them, though I cannot imagine what or why." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Instead, she asked, "Who handled the hymn books before they went to be rebound?" The Reverend looked uncertain. "I took charge of them at first, but Harold Finch volunteered to assist, said he had a careful eye and wished to help the parish." Miss Marple nodded once, slowly. Of course he had. Before she could speak further, footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Mrs. Albright hurried in, her face pale as ivory. "Thomas, come quickly. It's Eleanor Finch. She's collapsed just outside the church gate." The Reverend rushed past her. Miss Marple followed, her shawl trailing lightly. Outside, a small group had already gathered. Eleanor lay on the grass, her breathing shallow, her eyes half closed. She looked exhausted, but not injured, at least not visibly. A faint blue bruise touched her wrist, almost hidden by her sleeve. When her eyes opened, they searched the faces around her, fearfully at first, until they found Miss Marple. The young woman's lips parted. "Please," she whispered, voice barely more than air. Don't let him take the books back." Her hand trembled as she reached for Miss Marple's. "They're not what they seem." Miss Marple squeezed her fingers gently, a steadying presence. "My dear," she said softly, "I believe you." Eleanor's fingers clung to Miss Marple's hand with surprising strength, as though that simple point of contact were the only steady thing in her world. Her breath trembled, shallow and uneven. For a moment, the villagers who stood around could only watch, unsure whether to help or retreat, caught, as always, between concern and curiosity. Reverend Albright knelt beside her. "Eleanor, we'll bring you inside and let you rest." "Lydia, fetch some water." But Eleanor shook her head, eyes fixed on Miss Marple. "No, not inside. He'll come looking." Her voice was hoarse, each word pulled up from somewhere tightly locked. Miss Marple lowered herself beside her, knees creaking just slightly, and softened her voice. "My dear, we shall go somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. But you must tell me what frightened you." Eleanor swallowed hard. She seemed to be gathering courage grain by grain, like sand slipping through her fingers. "The books, the ones Harold took to the bindery. There's something in them. He hid it there. Something the bank was meant to keep. Something everyone would ask about if it went missing." Miss Marple felt the pattern forming now. Quietly, but clearly, money, or something worth money. And Harold had used the church, an institution people trust without question, to hide whatever he did not want found. The bruise on Eleanor's wrist was beginning to darken. Reverend Albright lifted Eleanor carefully, with Miss Marple supporting her other side. No dramatics, no fuss. The kind of movement meant to preserve dignity, as well as comfort. They did not bring her into the church. Instead, they took her to Miss Marple's cottage, where the curtains were soft and the air gentle. Inside, Miss Marple guided Eleanor to the sofa and wrapped a small knitted blanket over her shoulders. Lydia Albright arrived shortly after with water and a warm compress. They spoke little. Too many words could overwhelm someone whose nerves were pulled thin. Only when Eleanor's breathing steadied did Miss Marple speak again. "You said he hid something in the books," she began softly. "Do you know what it is?" Eleanor stared down at her hands, twisting the corner of the blanket. Ledgers, pages from the bank records. Harold was taking small amounts, shifting figures. No one would notice, not at first. But then there was an audit coming. He panicked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He used the church project as cover, said no one bothers to look at hymn books. Miss Marple thought back to the faint heaviness she had felt when handling one, the uneven binding. Yes, now it made sense. "Did you confront him?" she asked gently. Eleanor closed her eyes. "I tried. I told him it was wrong. He said if I told anyone, no one would believe me, that I was emotional, that I was imagining everything." Her voice trembled. "And yesterday, he got angry, very angry." Miss Marple reached out and placed her hand lightly over Eleanor's. "You did the right thing coming to the church. You were brave." Eleanor's lips quivered, not in sadness now, but in the fragile relief of finally being heard. A soft knock sounded at the cottage door, then tentative, polite. Miss Marple looked to Lydia, who moved to answer. In the threshold stood Harold Finch, his face composed, his voice perfectly calm. "Good morning. I was told my wife may have come this way." Miss Marple did not rise. She merely folded her hands in her lap. Pleasant, grandmotherly, the very picture of harmless hospitality. "Indeed she did," Miss Marple said. "She is resting now." Something flickered through Harold's expression. Not anger, not yet, but something watchful, calculating. I'll take her home. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, warm even, but with the softness of wool pulled snug around steel. Oh no, I think she will remain here for a short while. She needs quiet, you understand. Harold's jaw tightened, only slightly. Most would not have noticed. He forced a thin smile. Very well, I'll return later. He stepped back, but the air shifted as he did, something in him not withdrawing, but setting. The door closed. Lydia exhaled shakily. Jane, he frightens me. Miss Marple nodded once. Yes, but we must be careful. He knows he is being watched now, and men like Harold Finch are most dangerous when they believe they are cornered. Eleanor looked up, fear returning to her eyes. He'll try to get the books back. He'll do anything. Miss Marple rose then, slow, steady, determined. Yes, she said, which is precisely why we must look inside them before he does. Miss Marple did not hurry. A rushed step could draw attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted. After ensuring Eleanor was settled with a cup of warm tea, and Lydia beside her, she wrapped a soft shawl around her shoulders and stepped quietly back toward the church. The morning air was cool and clear, the village just beginning to stir. A milk cart rattled past, a dog barked lazily from a garden gate, and somewhere a kettle whistled in a kitchen window. Everything outwardly ordinary. Yet Miss Marple knew well how easily the ordinary concealed wrongdoing. The church door was unlocked, as it tended to be during morning hours. Reverend Albright stood inside still, though now he seemed almost expectant, as though he knew Miss Marple would return. Without speaking at first, Miss Marple approached the table of hymn books again, 12 of them, arranged neatly, identical to the casual eye. But Miss Marple did not look casually. I believe, she murmured softly, that we should examine the bindings carefully, though not here in plain view. The Reverend nodded, already understanding the need for discretion. He took up 3 of the books, Miss Marple another 2, and they carried them to the vestry, where the door closed softly behind them. On the wooden table inside lay a small brass paper knife, delicate, sharp, and perfectly suited for what was required. Miss Marple ran her fingertips across the back binding of one book. The unevenness was faint, but unmistakable now that she knew it was there. Carefully, she eased the paper knife under the leather edge. The glue, still slightly fresh, gave way with a soft sigh. The Reverend watched, silent, grave. Within the hollowed spine of the hymn book, folded into a tight bundle, were pages, thin, finely printed, columns of numbers and names, bank ledger sheets. Miss Marple unfolded them with care. The figures were small adjustments, subtle changes. Fractions of sums moved here, trimmed there. But together, they painted a very clear pattern. Harold Finch had been stealing from the bank for months. Quietly, methodically, always just under the threshold where questions might be asked. Reverend Albright let out a quiet breath. "This is quite serious." "Yes," Miss Marple said, and Eleanor likely discovered it by accident. The Reverend's expression darkened. "If Harold realizes we know—" Miss Marple closed the book spine again, her fingertips calm, precise. "That," she said gently, "is why he must not know." Not yet. There were 11 more books. They opened 5. Each one contained ledger fragments, enough to prove wrongdoing, but carefully separated so that only someone with the full set could understand the entirety. It was not simply theft. It was deliberate concealment. Miss Marple replaced each bundle exactly as it had been found, hidden, intact, invisible to an unsuspecting glance. The books were then returned to their place in the sanctuary, untouched, unchanged in appearance. Only once every trace of disturbance was erased did Miss Marple step back and fold her hands lightly. We must proceed quietly. He will come for the books soon. He will try to remove them, tonight I expect. Reverend Albright swallowed. Should we inform the police? Not yet, Miss Marple replied. Harold Finch is a man who believes himself clever. Corner him at the wrong moment, and he will do something desperate. No, we must allow him to act and reveal himself fully. The Reverend nodded slowly, though worry tightened his eyes. Miss Marple stepped out of the vestry and into the quiet nave of the church. The stained-glass windows glowed softly in the late morning light. Everything felt peaceful, even holy. Yet hidden within the hymn books was the truth that could undo a man. As she walked back toward her cottage, she saw Harold Finch standing near the church gate, hands in his pockets, watching the building with the alert stillness of someone waiting for an opening. He did not see her at first, but when he did, he smiled, polite, composed, and utterly hollow. "Good morning, Miss Marple." She returned the smile, gentle, warm, grandmotherly. "Good morning, Mr. Finch." They held each other's gaze for only a moment, but in that single moment, something quiet and unmistakable passed between them. He knew she suspected him, and she knew he knew. The game had begun. Harold Finch's smile did not waver as he stood by the gate. It was the smile of a man who knew he must appear calm, even pleasant, to maintain his position in the village. A smile that believed itself convincing. Miss Marple, however, knew such smiles very well. They came from men who feared discovery, but believed themselves clever enough to avoid consequence. She returned it with her own gentle expression, the one that so often led people to underestimate her. "How fortunate," Harold said lightly, adjusting his coat sleeve, "that you were nearby to look after Eleanor. She can be sensitive." Miss Marple nodded, as though in full agreement. "Many women are, Mr. Finch, especially when burdened with something troubling." For one fraction of a second, his eyes sharpened, too quick for most to notice. But Miss Marple did not miss such things. "Well," he said, recovering his composure, "I should go and see how she is." Miss Marple stepped just slightly into his path. Not obstructing, merely present. "Not yet," she said softly. "She is resting, and there are others with her. You know how distress can affect a young lady. Best not to unsettle her further." There was nothing in her tone but warm concern, but the meaning beneath was unmistakable. Harold's jaw tightened once more, though he forced it still. "Of course," he said, a considerate suggestion. He tipped his head politely, then walked away down the lane, steps measured, coat neat, every movement shaped by self-control. But his hands, Miss Marple noticed, curled very slightly into fists when he thought no one could see. She watched him disappear around the corner before continuing home. Inside the cottage, Eleanor was sitting upright now, though her face remained pale. Lydia Albright sat beside her, smoothing her hair with quiet tenderness, a gesture more comforting than words. Miss Marple took her seat across from them. "My dear," she said softly, "the books are indeed as you feared." Eleanor's breath caught, though she did not look surprised, only relieved. "He'll try for them," she whispered. "He has to. If the bank notices the missing funds, he has no defense without those pages." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "which means his next steps will be swift and nervous. He will likely come to the church tonight, when it is empty." Reverend Albright, who had returned with fresh tea, frowned. Should we be there to stop him? Miss Marple considered this carefully. We must allow him to act, but not to succeed. If he removes the books quietly, suspicion vanishes with them. Better to let him attempt the act and allow someone else to see him do so. Lydia blinked. Someone else? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression serene. Constable Evans. The Reverend nodded slowly. The constable was a kind man, a bit slow in speech perhaps, but firm in responsibility, and unlike the rest of the village, he did not underestimate Miss Marple. Eleanor's hands trembled again. But when Harold sees the police, Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but steady. He will believe he has been caught because of his own actions, not because of anything you told. Eleanor stared at her, tears gathering, but these were not the terrified tears of earlier. They were tears shaped by relief, by the faint return of safety. Miss Marple smiled at her, a small, soft smile that held far more strength than comfort. "Your part now," she said, "is only to rest." The sun dipped slowly toward afternoon as the plan took shape. Miss Marple sent a note. Discreetly written, discreetly delivered, requesting Constable Evans to call, but not openly. The constable would come later, quietly, through the side path behind the vicarage. The church would remain as it was, doors unlocked for evening prayer. Inviting, ordinary, nothing out of place. But by nightfall, everything in St. Winifred's would be poised. The village would seem calm. The hymn books would sit undisturbed. And Harold Finch, believing himself unseen, would move toward the church with his final chance to save himself. Miss Marple sat by her window as evening settled, the sky bruising into twilight. The game was now at its quiet turning point, and the next move would not be hers. Evening settled over St. Winifred's with a hush that felt heavier than usual. Lamps glowed behind curtains, doors were latched, and the village moved into its nighttime quiet. But this quiet felt attentive, as though the shadows themselves were watching. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resting loosely in her lap. The needles were still. She was not knitting to pass time now, but to listen, to the faint shift of the village, to the soft footsteps outside, to the heartbeat of what was about to unfold. Constable Evans arrived just past twilight, exactly as requested. He did not knock. He slipped in through the back gate and entered Miss Marple's cottage with the light, careful tread of a man who understood the importance of not being seen. Eleanor lay resting on the sofa, her breathing finally steady, though anxiety lingered beneath the surface. She looked up when Evans entered, but Miss Marple gave her a reassuring nod. "Mr. Evans," Miss Marple said softly, "Harold Finch will come to the church tonight. He intends to remove the hymn books and destroy what they contain." Constable Evans, not a man given to many words, nodded once. His expression was firm, steady. "I'll be waiting." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Not inside the church. If he sees you, he'll run. And a man who believes escape is his only option is dangerous. No, you must hide near the vestry door, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid detection." Evans listened carefully. He always had respected Miss Marple's judgment more than most. "And when he takes the books?" he asked quietly. "Let him remove them," Miss Marple said. "Only once he has them in his hands should you step forward. And you must speak very calmly. Men like Harold panic when faced with consequences. Calm is essential." Evans nodded again. "I can do that." When he left to take his post, the cottage dipped back into a softer silence. Lydia kept watch over Eleanor, reading a small prayer book by lamplight. Eleanor dozed intermittently, though her brow remained furrowed in sleep. Miss Marple remained by the window. Hours passed gently, like pages turning. Then at last, near midnight, movement, a figure slipping from the Finch house. Harold Finch walked with purpose, not hurried, not nervous but sharp with determination. His coat was buttoned tight, a small satchel slung over his shoulder. The moonlight traced the angles of his face, and though his expression was calm, there was something brittle beneath it, like ice just beginning to crack. Miss Marple did not rise abruptly. She simply stood, smoothed her shawl, and slipped out the back door, moving quietly along the hedgerow path that ran behind the gardens. She knew every inch of this village. It held no shadows unfamiliar to her. She arrived near the churchyard, just as Harold reached the side door. It opened soundlessly. He had oiled the hinges earlier then. That alone told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Inside, the church was still. The air felt dense with waiting. Harold crossed the aisle in a straight line to the hymn books, his movements rehearsed. He took 3, then another 3, stacking them carefully into the satchel. His breathing quickened only when he turned to the last set. His hands trembled. He knew this was his final chance. When the satchel was full, he exhaled shakily. Only then did Constable Evans step from behind the vestry door. "Harold Finch," he said, voice level, steady, almost gentle. "I'll need you to set the bag down." Harold froze. His back stiffened. He did not turn. "Put it down," Evans repeated. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then Harold turned slowly, the satchel strap tightening in his grip. His pupils were sharp, alert, calculating. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he said quietly. Evans did not move toward him. "And if you run," Evans replied, "everyone will know what you've done." Harold's jaw clenched. His voice lowered to a rasp. "They already will, because she told someone." Miss Marple stepped forward now, from the shadowed aisle near the back, the place she had chosen long before Harold entered. "No, Mr. Finch," she said softly. "Eleanor did not betray you. You betrayed yourself the moment you chose deception over honesty." Harold stared at her then, not with anger, but with cold, stunned disbelief. He had underestimated her. He had assumed, as so many did, that she was simply a quiet old woman who noticed gardens and knitting patterns. But Miss Marple had noticed him. All human nature repeats. She continued gently, "I have seen men do exactly as you've done before. They always believe they are clever. They always believe they can hide the truth. But the truth, Mr. Finch, has a way of appearing, no matter how deeply it is tucked away." Harold's grip loosened. The satchel slipped from his hand. The books struck the floor with a muted, heavy thud. Evans stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. No struggle came. The desperation had already drained from Harold's eyes, replaced by hollow resignation. Miss Marple watched as he was led out into the night, the church doors closing softly behind them. Only when the echo faded did she allow herself a slow breath. The village would wake to whispers. Reputations would shift. The quiet calm of St. Winifred's would tremble for a time. But Eleanor Finch, at least, would sleep in peace tonight. Miss Marple walked down the aisle alone, her shawl trailing behind her like fading twilight. The mystery was not fully solved yet. The explanation still needed to be spoken, gently, clearly, so all could understand. But the heart of it had revealed itself exactly where Miss Marple had known it would, in the small things people thought no one noticed. The village awoke the next morning to the sort of hush that precedes a storm, not one of wind and rain, but of words. News in St. Winifred's did not travel by post or proclamation. It moved through the clatter of teacups, through the pause before a greeting, through the shared look between two women passing on the lane. And on this morning, those looks held a question. What happened last night at the church? Constable Evans did his part discreetly. Harold Finch had been taken to the station in the early hours, his carriage drawn quietly so as not to rouse the street dogs. Yet by breakfast time, everyone knew something had occurred, even if they did not yet know the shape of it. Miss Marple did not indulge the whispering. She had seen enough mornings like this in her life to know the danger in rumors left to swell. So she walked to the church at a calm, steady pace, her shawl neatly folded, her expression composed. Reverend Albright stood inside the sanctuary, straightening hymnals on the pews with a care that betrayed his unsettled thoughts. When he saw Miss Marple, he stopped smoothing the pages and simply exhaled. "It's a dreadful thing," he murmured, "to think everything was happening right under our roof." "Deception," Miss Marple said gently, "very often chooses the nearest shelter. Trust makes for a comfortable hiding place." The Reverend's eyes flicked toward the vestry where the satchel had been placed, evidence now waiting to be catalogued. "I can barely imagine how Eleanor must feel this morning." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "We must speak with her before the village speaks for her." They walked together to Miss Marple's cottage, where Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in one of Miss Marple's knitted shawls, hands encircling a teacup that had long gone cool. Her eyes were clearer now, though tired, very tired, but there was something new there as well, the first trace of steadiness. Lydia Albright sat beside her, offering patient, unpressing company. When Miss Marple and the Reverend entered, Eleanor lifted her gaze. "I didn't want it to happen like that," she whispered. "I didn't want him shamed." "No one wishes for such things," Miss Marple replied softly. "But truth rarely waits for permission." Eleanor shut her eyes for a moment, gathering something within. "I thought I could fix it quietly. Thought if I just reasoned with him, reminded him that the church had helped us when we married, that people had trusted him. But he kept saying, I didn't understand." Miss Marple took the seat across from her. "Understanding right and understanding someone are not always the same. Many women learn that lesson painfully." Eleanor's lips trembled, but she did not break. "What will happen now?" The Reverend spoke gently. "The bank will be notified. There will be inquiries. But, Eleanor, you must know, none of this is your fault." A tear slipped down her cheek at the simple truth of that. Only one, but it carried months of silent endurance. Miss Marple allowed a quiet pause before continuing. "There are two matters that must be decided. The first concerns the hymn books. They will be returned, with the documents removed, so the church may remain a place of peace, not a relic of wrongdoing." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And the second," Miss Marple continued, voice soft as falling dust, "concerns your future, my dear. You need not return to that house unless you choose to." Eleanor looked up sharply, as if the idea had not been allowed to surface until spoken aloud. "I don't know where to go," she breathed. Miss Marple smiled, gentle, warm, and quietly reassuring. "St. Winifred's has never let one of its own stand alone. You will stay here for now. Lydia will help arrange the rest. There are kind souls enough here who remember who you were before." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in relief so profound it softened her entire posture. Outside footsteps approached on the garden path. Constable Evans appeared in the doorway, holding his hat in his hands. "Miss Marple," he said, "Mr. Finch has requested to speak with you." Eleanor flinched. Her fingers tightening on the teacup, Miss Marple rose. placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You need not face him," she said to Eleanor, "but I will." For Miss Marple understood something the village did not yet know. Harold Finch did not request her presence out of remorse. He requested it because even now, he believed there was still a move left to play, and Miss Marple knew one must always listen to a cornered man. Very carefully. Miss Marple did not hurry to the station. She walked with the same steady, measured pace she used on mornings when she stopped to look at roses or paused to greet neighbors. The stillness was intentional. She knew that when one approaches a man cornered by consequences, it is wise to bring calm with you. The constable opened the door to the small interview room with a respectful nod. Harold Finch sat inside, hands folded neatly on the table, posture straight. He looked composed, almost serene. But there was a tautness around his eyes, a small flicker that betrayed a man calculating outcomes with diminishing options. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone smooth, polite. "Thank you for coming." She sat opposite him, folding her hands gently on her lap, as though they were simply two acquaintances sharing a quiet conversation. Harold's gaze held hers. "You've placed yourself in the center of something you don't fully understand." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "On the contrary, Mr. Finch, I understand precisely what has occurred." His jaw tightened for a single heartbeat, then relaxed. "Do you? You removed funds in small increments, so they would go unnoticed. That required patience and a certain confidence in your own cleverness. But when the bank announced an audit, you needed a place to hide the irregularities, a place trusted, untouched." She paused gently. "The church was convenient." He exhaled, slow, deliberate. "I did what was necessary." "To preserve your position?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Or to preserve the way others saw you?" His eyes sharpened, just a flicker. There it was. The first true reveal, not guilt, but pride. "You think this village understands me?" he said quietly. "They see me as some clerk, polite, useful, small. I was improving my situation, building something. Eleanor should have supported me." Miss Marple's expression did not shift, but there was the slightest sadness in her eyes, the kind reserved for human failings that repeat across years and names. "Your wife," she said gently, "has been frightened for a long time." Harold's fingers curled, then forced themselves flat again. "She imagines things. She always has. It was better when she didn't question. She was happy then." "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "She was silent then." Silence filled the room. Not uneasy, but truthful. Harold leaned back slightly, watching her, searching for weakness. "You've made quite an impression on her, but you don't understand her. Eleanor has always needed someone to tell her what to do. She'll fall apart without me." Miss Marple shook her head. "Just once. Eleanor has already stopped falling." For the first time, Harold's control slipped. The slightest crack, fear, not of punishment, but of losing power. "None of this has to be permanent," he said suddenly, voice lowering, persuasive. "If the books disappear, and they can, easily, there will be no evidence. I could leave the village quietly. Eleanor would come with me in time. You could tell them she needed her marriage to remain intact, that she was emotional, impressionable." Miss Marple lifted her gaze to meet his fully. No, the word was calm, small but final. Harold's face froze. Miss Marple continued, her voice the gentle firmness of someone explaining a hard truth to a child. "You believed no one would see what you were doing because you assumed no one was watching. But someone always watches, Mr. Finch. It is in the nature of small villages and small rooms and small lies. They leave trails, even when you think you've covered them." Harold's composure broke, not dramatically, just the smallest collapse around the eyes, the acceptance of inevitability. "You've ruined my life," he murmured. "No," Miss Marple said softly. "You did that yourself, long before the money, when you decided your wife's voice should not count. That was the first wrongdoing, and all others followed." Silence held them both for a moment. Then Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You should rest now," she said gently. "The magistrate will speak with you soon." Harold did not reply. Miss Marple stepped out into the morning light. The air felt fresher, clearer, as though something heavy had shifted at last. The village would gossip. Yes, it would rearrange loyalties, rewrite stories, and examine the Finch's marriage with hindsight sharpened to a knife's edge. But all that would come later. For now, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where Eleanor sat waiting, not for explanations, but for the simple reassurance that comes from knowing the world will not collapse beneath her feet. Miss Marple opened the door softly. "You are safe," she said, and Eleanor finally, quietly, believed her. The days that followed unfolded quietly, though not without their ripples. St. Winifred's did what small villages always do in the aftermath of scandal. It murmured, adjusted, and slowly absorbed the new reality until it seemed, to those who had not lived through it, as though it had always been so. Doors leaned opened more cautiously, conversations paused a breath longer when certain names were mentioned, and the church bells rang with a tone that felt just slightly changed. Eleanor stayed with Miss Marple for the first few days. There was no dramatic outpouring of grief, no collapse or outcry. Rather, it was a quiet readjustment, as though she was learning to exist in a world where she was no longer spoken over. She helped Lydia Albright in the garden, folding laundry and tying string around bunches of lavender. She took walks at dusk in the green lanes, her shoulders slowly lowered from the place they had lived for months. Slightly lifted, braced for impact, Miss Marple watched her gently, never intruding. Healing, she knew, was a slow thing, like ivy reclaiming an old stone. One afternoon, Eleanor approached Miss Marple where she sat knitting on the porch. The young woman's face was calmer now, still pale, still delicate, but marked with a new firmness. "I went to the church this morning," she said softly, "just to sit, and it didn't frighten me." "That is good," Miss Marple replied, without looking up from her stitches. "Peace returns to places where truth has settled." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before she spoke again. "They asked if I would sing with the choir again. I thought I might." Miss Marple's hands paused briefly, then continued, the faintest smile touching her lips. "That would be very nice. My dear, the church would become hers again. Not a place of fear, but of voice." Later that same evening, Reverend Albright called at the cottage. The ledger pages had been given to the bank inspectors, and it was clear now that Harold Finch had acted alone. There would be legal proceedings, of course, but the outcome was almost assured. Fraud was not a crime that allowed for ambiguity. Before leaving, the Reverend asked, somewhat hesitantly, "Miss Marple, how did you see it so quickly, so clearly?" Miss Marple's answer came gently, without flourish. "People tell you who they are, Reverend Albright, often not with their words, but with the little things. A hand that holds too tightly, a voice that interrupts, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and sometimes—" Her knitting needles paused lightly in the air. "It is simply that one has seen it all before, in other names, in other rooms, with other hymns." The Reverend nodded, thoughtful. "Human nature," he murmured. Miss Marple agreed, returning to her stitches. Human nature repeats rather more than people believe. As summer moved along, the churchyard roses bloomed again, and the village returned to its rhythms. Not unchanged, but steadied, Eleanor sang again on Sundays. Her voice was not strong at first, but it was clear, and it did not tremble. Harold Finch's name was spoken less each week, until one morning it simply did not surface at all. And St. Winifred's, with its white fences and sparrows and blackberry jam, felt itself righted once more. Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, finished her knitting at last, the shawl completed, the final stitch tied. She held it up in the afternoon light, admiring its neat pattern. She would give it to Eleanor, not as a gift, but as a beginning, certainly. Here is the true, final section, offering a clear, elegant, Miss Marple-style explanation scene, where everything fits together, and the emotional arc reaches closure. The following Sunday brought with it a golden, forgiving warmth. The churchyard was lively once again, though not with the carefree chatter of the garden tea. It was quieter, more thoughtful, as though the village understood that something delicate had shifted among them. After the service, Reverend Albright invited the congregation to remain. Miss Marple sat modestly near the back, her hands folded, an unspoken knowledge that the moment for explanation had come. The Reverend cleared his throat gently. Many of you have heard fragments regarding the events of these past few days. But truth is best spoken plainly and without adornment. He glanced to Miss Marple, who gave a small, encouraging nod. So he continued. Harold Finch was found to have been removing funds from the bank in small, hidden increments. The discovery was nearly made during a scheduled audit. To conceal this, he hid the altered pages within our newly rebound hymn books. His wife, Eleanor, saw what was happening and tried to come forward, though the burden she carried was heavy and frightening. A murmur rose. Sympathetic this time, not cruel. Reverend Albright looked to Eleanor, who sat among the choir. She kept her gaze lowered, but she did not shrink. Miss Marple stood then, not commanding the room, but gently guiding its attention, as she always had. In matters such as these, she said softly, it is rarely the grand gesture or the dramatic moment that reveals the truth. It is the small things, the way Eleanor's hand trembled, the way Harold corrected her sentences for her, the slight heaviness of a hymn book that should have weighed less. People listened, leaning forward just slightly, the village instinctively recognizing that the explanation was not merely about crime, but about people. Most wrongdoing, Miss Marple continued, begins not with malice but with entitlement, a belief that one deserves more than one has, and when others become obstacles to that belief, they are simply managed. She did not look at Harold's empty seat. She didn't need to. Her eyes were on Eleanor. But strength, Miss Marple said, is not always loud. Sometimes it is simply enduring until one moment of courage arrives, as Eleanor found hers. The stillness that followed was full, warm, and for the first time since this began, Eleanor lifted her head. When the congregation dispersed, no one crowded her, no one questioned her. They simply made space for her to stand and breathe and choose her next steps. Outside, Miss Marple walked slowly toward her garden gate. Eleanor followed a few paces behind, not calling out, simply drawing near the way someone approaches a place of safety. "Miss Marple?" she said at last. "Yes, my dear." There was no trembling now, only quiet certainty. "I think I would like to start again, not somewhere new, here, but on my own terms." Miss Marple's eyes warmed gently. "That," she said, is the beginning of more than you know. They walked together a little way, the path soft with fallen petals, the village stirred but calm, the future not yet fully formed but finally possible. And Miss Marple, with her shawl folded over her arm, felt satisfied in the way she always did after the truth had been allowed to breathe. Life once again had settled into its right and proper place. Not perfect, never perfect, but honest, and that was enough.